Welcome. I am delighted that we have 29 books floating out there of people who were exploring this, and I'm sure that many of you thought we trusted him when he suggested this book, and now you're about you're halfway through the introduction, and you're like, I don't want to read this, and that's okay if you feel that way. My advice to you would be that read through it and don't worry about understanding it. Because what's going to happen is, so I had a professor say this once about a really thick book named On the Christian Faith by a 17th century theologian by the name of Schleiermacher. And he said, just read it, don't stop. He said, if you feel like all of a sudden you've gone 3 pages and it doesn't make sense, and don't go back and reread it, just keep reading. And that's what I would suggest. It's not a long book. Most of the chapters are around 10 to 12 pages. Read it beforehand if you want, but what I would recommend is reading after. So because what we're going to do is, in particular, as we get going in it, I'm here to fill in the blanks and fill in the conversations and help give you the things that are between the lines that help this argument shine and come forth. And that's one of the challenges of it, is if you don't know what new monasticism is, or missional theology, or some of these terms that he's throwing out there, it doesn't make sense. But if you know what they are, then it actually, you join us. Okay.
I do.
So I'm going to fill some of those in, but I'm delighted that there is enough people to look at this, because I think what it's going to do for our community of faith is begin a conversation. We are at a very critical time, not only in the life of this church, and I think a lot of those of you in the boomer generation realize that. You're asking, I think people in the boomer generation are asking about churches as a whole. What are we handing off the church to? Gen Xers, in particular millennials, have left the church. So who are these faith communities being handed to, and what's going to happen? We're also in a time of immense change in the church. We're wrestling with the identity of what the church is. And I think that in the midst of this small little town here in the mountains, we too are asking, what is the next phase of this church? We're approaching our 150th year. Many of the folks in your generation are moving away. Some of the older ones are passing away. And so there's this constant sort of shift and change, and we're sort of at the crux of this. What do we want this, you said here. What do you want? What do we want our community to be? And so I am not, just to be clear, I want to say this just without any, it's like a body, if that's right there, recording. Okay. If you whisper anything, Linda, it will pick you up. So you should keep any snide remarks, say it towards that way. But that question of what is that? Who are we? What are we going to be? And I'm not saying in any way, and I have a monastic background, monasticism connections. I wrote on the Mosaic, that sort of stuff in the background. That you're going to see this word monasticism. I want to say unequivocally right now, I am not in any way, shape, or form trying to turn this church into a monastic community. But I do think there are tremendous things that we can learn from monastic communities about what it means to be community, what it means to dwell together as a community of faith, what it means to really embrace some of the fragmentation we're seeing in culture, and quite frankly, we're in the perfect location to do it. Welcome, right up here. Good for you. Right there. You don't have to sit there. You can sit anywhere, but yeah. Sit anywhere you want. I'll prefer a chair. Maybe let's put that over there in case someone comes in. So all that's to say is don't and I reason I don't want to be or muddle through the book and think, what is Jason trying to say? I don't have any hidden agenda. And in part, that's why I think we're starting here, because there are things that I have learned from the monastic movement and monastic communities that I think that we are going to need as we move into the future as the church. And it's not surprising. And what you're going to see in the argument that Wilson makes is, and particularly you'll see it in this coming week when you read or if you look at the chapter 1, is we are very much at a similar place that they were in the 500s and around the beginning of the Dark Ages. There are so many things that are happening in our culture. And if you've studied the Dark Ages, you can begin to see and you study the current social context, you see all sorts of parallels. So this argument that we're looking at, that comes from this book, I want to share a few resources, and you're welcome to borrow it. This is Alistair McIntyre's After Virtue, and this is the primary source upon which this book, this is the original one that I had read many years ago, the one you have. This is an interpretation of this. Likewise, a guy named Rod Dreyer wrote another interpretation of this, and he's actually Orthodox. He became Orthodox, but because he's in the Orthodox Church, much of his interpretation of it probably I don't agree with 100% of it. With it, but I think it probably appeals more to evangelicals, quite frankly, than it does to mainline Protestants. It tends to lean more towards moral issues than virtue issues of virtue. We'll get into that later. So I wanted to make that. So if you're welcome to borrow this, if you want to read another version of this, you're welcome to borrow this if you want to bore yourself to death. This, and honestly, folks, this book is what made this intelligible to me. As a PhD student reading all sorts of heavy, dense prose, I sat down to read this and I was like, I'm sort of lost. And someone said, have you read this? And I said, no. And I read this. And then after reading this felt like it was a breeze because I had the structure of what was happening in it down. I'll point out this book shortly, but one of the things that you did muddle through the introduction is that he mentioned a book called Christ and Culture. And I'll talk about the schema, the typology that Niebuhr lays out in Christ and Culture. This was a pretty famous book many years ago, but has been very influential in theological thought as a whole. And you're welcome to borrow this. And then, these are all books that have come out in the last probably 20 years. And I have lots of books on monasticism in a variety of different forms. But these are all sort of new expressions of monasticism that has surfaced really since about 2000. If I gave you like a 1-minute tour, what it would be is around the late 90s, early 2000s, my generation, Generation Xers, began to actually seek out higher church environments and Roman Catholic and Orthodox expression, Anglican expressions of faith, because we were the first generation raised in the sort of Mickey Mouse era of age and stage ministry, of youth group ministry, of these sort of things that took us out of the sacredness of some of the practices of the church and made it very fun and active. And I think that my generation sort of sought some of these things out. So as a consequence, many of these books were written by Gen Xers or younger boomers who found themselves sort of longing for a sense of mystery. And this is one of the critiques that Wilson makes in this book, is that the mystery of the Christian faith was lost in the Enlightenment. We're going to go over it, and you may hear the Enlightenment, you're like, I don't know what years those are. We're going to go over that, and I'll brush up on that. New Friars. And again, these are, you're welcome, if you want to flip through these, you're welcome to borrow these. New Friars, a book about mission and to poverty situations in the current context. Flirting with Monasticism. A friend of mine who I knew many years ago wrote a book just kind of about finding some of the ancient practices that were in the monastic tradition that she found, she was flirting, just sort of toying with. A Journey into Lay Monasticism. There's the largest monastic movement towards Benedictine monasticism right now in the history of the world. There are more people turning to monasticism as what we call Benedictine oblates. They're like this sort of sector. Ed Nettleton is a Benedictine oblate. He has associated himself with a monastery and revisits that monastery and is connected to that monastery. One of my professors from Wheaton, Dennis Ockholm, who wrote Monk Habits for Everyday People, also a Benedictine oblate. And so you have this How to Be a Monastic and Not Leave Your Day Job, written by another, and then I would be included in that never received there's a monastic community and young adults who pray and be together. In fact, it is the only place that Roman Catholics and Protestants actively take the Eucharist together with the Vatican's knowledge. They turn a blind eye to it.
Wow.
It is an international phenomenon. And so, and for those of you who don't know, I wrote this book and then my dissertation was on it. I arrived the night this as a community that was founded in 1940. And the night I arrived, the founder was murdered at the church about 30 feet from me. And yes, it's the first chapter.
Like violently murdered?
I wrote a woman who had been kicked out of the community several years earlier. She came up to him, whispered something in his ear and slit his throat. And half the brothers were in Cologne, found out about this, and so there were about 25, and this was like less than 2 hours after I got it from an overnight flight. It was the most surreal thing for that. But Roger. But in the next week, about 15,000 people showed up on the grounds to pay homage and respects to him, and dignitaries from all branches of Christianity. It was, and so anyway, all that's to say is the influence that monastic spirituality is having right now may not be something that you're all aware of, but is something that is happening not only in our country, but it's happening globally. And I say that, and publications are just, and then these are two, they talked about new monasticism. New monasticism is something that I sort of started toying with when I was working on intentional communities and things like that. Yeah, Jay.
Could you give us a definition?
I will, of new monasticism. Yeah. Yeah, I'll do that. You hold that in 1 second. I will. So that's kind of that's what we're going to do. Don't read into anything. This really is and self-proclaimed in the book. He says they're just trying to highlight a way that we can live out the Christian faith as this world changes around us. And that is one of the main sort of premises that he presents in his introduction. Is he says it again and again in multiple places, that the gospel doesn't change. The mission and the calling we have in our lives to proclaim the gospel doesn't change, but we are constantly in an ever-changing culture. And culture was slower at one point changing, so Christianity was slower to change with it. But we are at probably the height of change in our culture that we have seen in over a century. With COVID, with the political turmoil and strife and tribalism that we've seen over the last few years, in our Western United States culture, we are at the pinnacle of where, and coming out of this COVID, I mean, and obviously, you probably don't hang out with a lot of pastors other than maybe me or Ed, but pastors across the country are fearful and saying, what is the future of the church? Will people return to church? Will people, is it going to go be half virtual? And I think we're going to see a massive transition in the church landscape or in the religious landscape in the next decade. So we, as a community of faith, embedded in this little, somewhat isolated, already in the vein of monastic experience in this little mountain town, have options about how we live out our faith. And I think one of the things, people have always asked me since the last year, how long are you going to stay? And I said, I promise 7 years until after the. But honestly, I could stay here for a long time. And what the difference is am I just a pastor at a small church that just does Sunday services and people get their Sunday pill and pop it in? I don't think that's what we're doing. I actually think that we have the potential to live out and live more intentionally into the idea of Christian community. And not just because, that feels better, but because that is actually what we are called to do.
That's why we called you, Jason.
Because the things that came out of the Enlightenment that led to the era that we're living in now, to the destruction of what we're happening, these are not the things, not the fullest expression of how we can live out our lives. And honestly, I mean, I'm almost 50, so I'm thinking I got at least, 30, 40 years. I'm looking ahead 30, 40 years. I want those 30, 40 years to be lived out in the most ideal and faithful way God has called me. So it's a journey that I'm after, and it's a journey that I'm seeking after. And so I hope that's something, feel free just to go for it, John. There's nothing more delightful than that crackling sound. I love all of God's creatures, except for mosquitoes and flies. That's what I call. So what I'm gonna suggest with this book is this. I did have a little wrap. I think this book is amazing, in part because there are things about my own life. I have had monastic inclinations for many, many years. When I went to grad school, I was just all of a sudden, there was just something about it. And I actually do believe that in our essential beings, there's a monastic in all of us. Because at the core of monasticism, there's a deep sense of peace and stillness. And I believe that we were in some way inherently created to be people of peace and stillness. And that doesn't mean we can't be loud other times, but to have an inner peace about us that we often associate with people who are in monastic communities. So I think I've always had that desire for that. I was called the youth ministry when I was 14. So and I've been doing ministry theology and ministry is all that I know. And in terms of a field of study, if I ever left it, I'd be in trouble. But I have witnessed the loss of my own generation and younger leave the church. And I have been actively involved as a student and as a teacher and as an educator to try to reverse that trend. And that's how it got me into the whole intergenerational thing, which I think is, not where we are. But someday we might be back there again, where that will be an expression of who we are. But addressing this hemorrhaging of the church, what is the next stage of the church? Is something that fascinated me about it. I think I was at the time wrestling, when I read it, I was wrestling with how age and stage ministry has failed. In the 1970s, we thought, let's take our kids and stick them all out here in Mickey Mouse's ear and let's do fun stuff out there and give them food and this will be great. And we're paying attention to their developmental needs. And the result of that will be that there are more committed Christians going on. Well, we very soon found out several decades later that was a complete erroneous idea. Because if that actually worked, we would be facing the largest exodus of people from the church in the history of Christianity, what we're facing right now. So we are at a pandemic or whatever, epidemic of sizable proportions in the Western church in particular. I think the other thing, and probably I figured this out about me, is and I'll talk about these terms, I'm very big into missional theology, which deals with what our calling is in proclaiming God's mission. I use a lot of language of the proclamation of the gospel and bearing witness, because that is fundamental to my understanding of what we are called to be as the church. And that sense of Christian vocation. I have a specialized Christian vocation. I get the privilege of spending my day around theology and teaching and talking and cultivating these conversations. You all don't have, you could do that more, but maybe hanging out with me or something like that. But in your average day, that's not your norm. But I do think that in spite of that, there's a space in between that says I can still be driven by an understanding of my calling as a Christian. And when that sense of vocation drives the day, the moment you wake up to the moment you go to bed, you find that you'll live your life in a very different sort of perspective. And I think the last thing, and I think this hopefully will be a benefit to this community as a whole, I'm a self-identified communitarian. And what I mean by that is I will always emphasize community over individuals. I believe that we were created and designed to be in relationship with one another. In fact, I think the relationality that we have as human beings, the way we relate to one another, is part of the image of God that was given to us in creation. And one of the things that differentiates us from animals is that we have rich relationships. So I think that we are called to work out our faith in community. And I think that one of the bad things, if I will, that came out of the last decade, or the last century of evangelicalism is the individualized Jesus and me movement. That Jesus and me the relationship is only about Jesus and me. And the challenge of that is that what we've forgotten is the minute I enter into a relationship with Christ, it's no longer Jesus and me, it's Jesus and you and all of us, because it is by nature a communal expression of the Trinity that we find, that relationship that we find in the Trinity. All right. Any questions before we start? I'm going to do definitions, and I'll do them, and I'll do a couple up front. But was there any, if we are, as we are going, if there are places where you're like, I put a question mark there, or I scribbled out something because I didn't understand it, or I got really mad. Those are the points where we want to bring up. What I have done is I just photocopied the book into 8.5 by 11s and kind of wrote my notes around it. So we're literally, as far as the introduction goes, we're going to go through it page by page. And what I want to just sort of walk you through and give you some of those, fill in some of those blanks, so that as you tackle the rest of the book, you feel oriented. Consider this your orientation. But before we start, let's take a moment and offer a word. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for your church. We thank you that we are in it. I thank you for those who are participating in this conversation as we wrestle with this idea about what the future church is and what we are called to be here in Lake City. I ask that your Spirit would move in us, and that you would move in our minds and our hearts, and you would touch strings, and that you would begin to cast a vision from the community that is here of what our future may be. We pray these things in the name of your Son, Christ Jesus. Amen. So when I read this book for the very first time, and again, I was trying to get through the other one, I had not really considered how it related to monasticism as a whole. And so I have to admit, when I sat down last night, I'm reading this with you, I did all this last night, and I read the introduction, and I was like, wow, things have changed. So this morning I read the old version, and really the difference, and I haven't read all the rest of the chapters, so I don't know the difference. I think that if I could have got this version, I would have had this version instead, because this is more of the argument without a lot of the monastic language. And this book was received well by this movement called New Monasticism. And as a consequence, when they republished it, I think they sort of tipped it a little bit too much in the scale of those who were seeking it out. So New Monasticism, let's start there, since it is in the title of the book, after Birch did New Monasticism. New Monasticism is a new version of monasticism. Now, let's go back. Surprise. Yeah, just breaking that simple. But here's the thing, if you don't know what monasticism is, and you kind of have this image of monks, it kind of has a, like, what's going on? And so monasticism really came about during the Dark Age. You had ascetics and hermits prior to the early desert fathers and mothers that went on in the first few centuries of the church, who probably were mentally ill, quite frankly, in some way, and they didn't understand, and so they went into some sort of massive, that they actually hurt themselves, or the notion of extreme asceticism, go sitting on a pole or starving yourself, and there was this, and the reason that came about is because at the time, Gnostic thought was still present, and that idea, because Greek, remember I just told you before that Greek thought moved sort of into the region of Jerusalem and that sort of surrounding area, sort of a couple hundred years before Christ. And so Gnosticism is a Greek philosophy that says the body is bad and evil. So these early Christian thinkers basically wanted to punish themselves because the body was evil, and they found that their spirits could rise if they punished themselves. Well, over time, this moved into mostly individuals living in hermits and caves. But during the Dark Ages, so around the 500s, late 500s, early 600s, you have this sort of decline of Western society centered around Rome, the fall of Rome. And during that time, when this was happening, everything was decadent. There was, quite frankly, one of the things that people have sort of mirrored or attached to the fall of Rome was gender confusion, transgender, cross-dressing, intergender, all these sort of things. Those were very prevalent during the fall of Rome and became an expression of Roman society. And not just in the male-female, but in social inversions of rich and poor and other ways. And so there just became this sort of like all bets were off. The culture that had been created that was really, and if you want to take a step back, and you're going to see this in next week's chapter, Christianity had a pretty rough beginning, and then Constantine came on the scene, legalized it, made it the Holy Roman Empire, and then over a period of about 150, 200 years, basically went throughout all of Europe, baptizing everyone, saying, you're Christian, I don't really care what you think. If you're a member of the Roman Empire, you are a Christian. Well, naturally, that's not going to take. And it led to a misunderstanding of Christian teaching, led to a dilution of Christian teaching, reduction of that, and eventually came to the place where the fall of Rome happened. And in the midst of this fall, you have this guy named Benedict, who escaped to the hills, but realized that he couldn't live alone, and began to actually sort of house a community. And we get from this idea of Benedict living in community in caves outside of the city of Rome was burning. We call it Cenobenic, meaning communal monasticism. And it really had this sense of who do I serve? I can't be alone as a monastic because I'm always called to serve the other. So eventually, Saint Benedict wrote a rule around how they would live their life to the T, like when during dinner time, you're gonna have one person reading, and this person will be safe, and this person is reading. And so it was a very structured rule, but that rule became so significant for the history of all of Western Christianity. And there was no Protestant, Catholic, Roman, there was no Orthodox, there was nothing, it was just Christians. And then what happened is, in the midst of this dark time, as the church and as the government tried to hold on to it, you had a character by the name of Gregory come out in the 600s, and he instituted Benedictine spirituality in the 600s for all of the Western church. So in other words, monastic spirituality became Western spirituality. And then in the 700s and the 800s, there was a mass missionary, sort of monastic missionary movement. It spread throughout Europe. And what he's saying in all of this, and as you'll see as he talks about this, is there was a dark age, there was a destruction of culture, there was a fragmented society where people didn't agree about anything, where there was tribalism, where people only sought to have their own pleasure being fulfilled. Lots of things in parallels we're seeing in culture right now, and 1,500 years later. And what he's saying is, he'll mention this, and I think he mentioned it in the preface to it, is at the end of this book, After Virtues, the original one, is, it says this, and if the tradition of the virtues was able to survive the horrors of the last dark ages, meaning the fall of Rome, what followed, we are not entirely without grounds for hope. In other words, if virtues emerged out of that dark time in history, hope can still emerge. This time, however, the barbarians are not waiting beyond the frontiers. Barbarian invasions is referencing. They have already been governing us for quite some time. So the barbarians are civilized, and the crooks wear ties. And it is our lack of consciousness of this that constitutes part of our predicament. We've become numb to what has happened in the Enlightenment and brought us to this place. And this is where he gets to all the Benedict stuff sort of comes to a head in this book. He says, perhaps we're not waiting for a Godot, which is a reference to a British play called Waiting for Godot, but for another doubtless very different Saint Benedict. So what he is suggesting is in that an era of moral decline and relativistic morality that is only seeking to serve one's own interests, that's what happened during Rome during the Dark Ages, that we are waiting for another expression of the church that will reestablish a sense of virtue in the church and civility, of proclaiming a faithful witness of what the kingdom is. And much of what came from that 700, 800 year monastic spread led to the development of other things, and did lead to the East-West split in the 11th century, but it led to what grew into much of our expression of the church, and to a period of really in the sort of 12th and 13th and 14th centuries, a period of immense mysticism and spiritual renewal. And there's all sorts of monastic movements that pop up from really you have another movement around the turn of the century or millennium. You have probably heard of Bernard of Clairvaux, or there are these thinkers and sort of people that came out around 12th, the Cistercians and the Trappists came out there. So there were these monastic movements that came out, and they were always in that sense of recovering that Benedictine spirituality. Why? Because it's simple. Pray, study scripture, be in community, serve your neighbor. And there's nothing fancy. Sit, be still in silence, and have that sense of devotion to God. Do everything you could as if you were in service to God. We kind of have stigmatized monasticism because we don't understand it, and we see it as separatists, which is what Wilson actually addresses. He said it's not a separatist. So yeah, Diane.
No, I was just nodding my head. When you do the definitions,
Yes.
are you going to define the church?
Yes, I will.
Good.
So I can. So new monasticism now is basically just in a time where we are so fragmented, we're so polarized, we're in a place, and there's these parallels. New monasticism is kind of a tipping attack, very much so, towards Saint Benedict, saying there's a new monastic expression that's coming out within the church right now. And and it may not be on your purview because you all are the faithful, is firmly established in your church here, or your church at home, so you're not seeing it. But in a landscape where people are saying, I need something more than what institutional religion has given culture, new monasticism is on the rise. So it is a movement. It came about kind of, I don't know if you've ever heard of the emerging church movement. It was probably from around the late 90s to sort of mid, maybe 2010s now, the emerging church movement. It was a bunch of Gen Xers who were from mainline denominations who didn't want to abandon theology, but wanted to abandon the fact that they didn't have any power in the church. So they all moved out and started like altar churches and things like that. I was not a part of it, just for whatever it's worth. I went to some of their stuff, but it was a little too like, emo, or, I don't know. It was just, it was too much. It was kind of gimmicky, I think, is the problem with that.
New age.
Not new age, because it was really historic. So around early 90s, they really theologians really started looking at what a guy named Robert Weber, who was a professor I had at Wheaton, introduced me to. It was called Ancient Future Faith, and it's the idea of ancient practices throughout the history of the church are now resurfacing in modern times. So if you've done Lectio Divina, or singing chants from church, doing Jesus prayer, or running time silence, historic monastic practices that we're realizing in a day and age where we have so much mediated through TV and screens and speakers, that sense of sort of connectivity to the historic church is important. And so we see that sort of replanting itself again and again. The problem is a lot of times those things are used in a very gimmicky way. Hey, let's do Lectio Divina today. Hey, let's do the Nation Examen over here. Do this over that. And the hope is to sort of like generate interest in spirituality without acknowledging the fact that many of these practices were done daily. Lectio Divina was a daily practice of reading scripture. So new monasticism is just an expression that has come out, and it really does center itself around lived communities. Not that it has to be, but there are new monastic communities, and they're not lived in like a commune. And he addresses the differentiation from commune. We'll go over that. But they're people who are choosing intentionally to live together by some sense of, whether written or spoken or bullet pointed, communal rule. In other words, they've made a decision to say, we are going to be an expression of Christian community, and we will commit to one another to that expression. And so they often have that output, or that what they're doing in terms of social justice things, or meeting social needs.
Is there something like that near us in Colorado?
I don't. There may very well be. I know there are monastic communities out here. Japuza, I don't know if you ever heard of Jesus People USA. They're a community in Chicago. They ran a big music conference called Cornerstone. They did it out of a field somewhere, Kansas or something. They were, and he mentions them actually. They were a community that rose up, and they're downtown Chicago. They have two old like hotels they turned into basically communal living. Now, I'm not ever suggesting that sort of expression of the church. Just sitting down, just to leave your concerns. But then, so when I first started getting into interest communities, I had a grant and I went around the country and visited. So I visited Jesus People USA. I actually met I went to when I was doing my PhD. There was an MDiv student there who arrived, who was born into that community in Chicago. Rutba House, he mentions, which is another community in Chicago. They have a house they live in, but then they also have people who buy houses in the community, and they share a common meal every night together. And they have chosen a way of living a rhythm of life out together that defines who they are in their existence in the world. And so that's kind of what it goes to.
It sounds like an HOA.
It's a little bit of an HOA, but was spread out properly. Okay, so to answer your question, the church then, did you have a question about that?
I just would like you to expand on the second part of this title, A Fragmented World.
But hold on to that thought, because when I describe the chapters, he has one that really addresses the difference between fragmentation and pluralism, and I'll get to that as well. So I will hit on that. But let's do it. We'll do it in the chapters. To answer your larger question, is that okay?
Yeah.
Diane, is the church when he refers? So the church has been conceptualized in a lot of different ways. You have the local church. You have the visible church, which includes everyone, even if you don't like everyone on the boat. Anyone who goes to church is part of that. And then you have the invisible church. And those are the people who, I don't know how the way to say it, they're truly committed. They actually are living out. So in other words, there's a differentiation because sometimes there are people in the church who may not, and we don't make the judgment between the visible and the invisible church, but it's an acknowledgement that. And the terms really came about during a time where there was more of a state church. And so people were in the church, even though they may not have been confessing. And so during like the 1930s and 40s, during the confessing church movement in Germany, you have people like Karl Barth and Dietrich Bonhoeffer. They came out with the confessing church because they were trying to unearth this real believing new church out of the state church. No?
That's not happening.
So when he talks about the church, he's talking about the church as a whole, the global church.
So like everyone,
Yes.
like every
Well, yes.
denomination, every.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, just the condition of the church. And he's talking about the US. He's talking about a Western context. And by Western, I mean largely out of Europe. So that would include Western, would include Australia and Canada and South Africa and some of these Western influenced countries. But when he's talking, the issue he is addressing is the results of the Enlightenment, so 1750, 250 years ago, on today's present time. So the church as a whole. Modernity, since I just mentioned that, modernity is the period of time between 1750, when we call Enlightenment, sort of, and I think therefore I am, and all the philosophical. So the sense of one's own existence very strong during the 1700s, for the first time perhaps in culture. Everyone was communally oriented, and you had a priest that would communicate spirituality, and no one could read up to about the 15th century. And then you had the printing press arrive on the scene in the 1400s, and that changed because then people got a German Bible, the Gutenberg press, and then everyone got started to get Bibles home, and then people started to read the Bible. So the Bible is the first text that most families had in their home. Well, as literacy grew, so did literature, so did intellectualism, and it all sort of from that time of the invention of the printing press in 1444, it was in 1440, to the Enlightenment, that's when the Reformation happened. So the author of the original, Alistair McIntyre, he didn't start this way, but he ended up joining the Catholic Church somewhere in the midst of writing this towards the end. Not because he thinks it's the ultimate expression, but because he thinks it's the last expression that the Western church had before individualism started to root its head. In other words, the things that we're facing in our culture right now started with the invention of criminals. Really started earlier than that, it's argued. But as people begin, so sola scriptura, scripture alone became the mantra of the Reformation. I'll learn on my own. I don't need priests to mediate God. God will be mediated through the word. So you have an elevation of the word, you have a critical analysis of the word. We strip out the apocrypha for various reasons. So for those who say, hey, the Bible has been the same forever, it has not been the same forever. And Luther, I'm sorry, I just don't, I'm gonna preach, we're gonna get to James in the Bible study, the word said about it. Doesn't mention Jesus and presents a person, but not surprisingly, the works mentality, James is a huge book for the Roman Catholic Church in particular, but the Roman Catholic Church has been accused, I went to Jan's Catholic, and Jan's Catholic too, so I have deep respect for the Catholic Church, but there is much more, I would say there's less grace in the Catholic Church, but I think there's less, I think grace is mediated differently. But what happens in the Reformation is we're like, forget it, you can't tell me what to do. So we have the priesthood of all believers, we have a breakdown, and then that's why then actually as structures we still fenced a few things. So we still get pastors who have to do the Eucharist, we get systems like that. But as time went on, that broke down. You come into America, you have the Great Awakening, you have all these pioneer folk who never heard anything, they bring retraining, the Second Great Awakening. Then at the turn of the 19th century, you have Azusa Street, you have Pentecostal movement. And the challenge that we have now in our culture is every single one of all of these denominations all think that their denomination got it right whenever they discover it. So Pentecostals will be like, the true church started at Azusa Street. No, the true church started when Christ established it. But so everyone, Methodist worship in style goes back to the Great Awakening. Revival, there's a lot of things that feed into that. Our worship goes back to the Reformation period, as do Lutheran and eventually Episcopalian worship. So that's why there is so much collegiality between Episcopalians, Lutherans, and Methodists and Presbyterians. Our worship was forged in the same era of the church. Theology is different, but the expression is very similar. Non-denominational churches that came out in the last century have a very similar style. Each of these are expressions, and what they're all dealing with is how do you figure out how to be the culture in an ever-changing time? One of the main premises. We can't control the change of culture, but we can be critically thoughtful about how the gospel is proclaimed and borne witness to in each of the cultures. And in a COVID era, post-COVID era, in a mountain town, we have such a weird, unique slice of that pie. The question becomes, how do we I don't know, for those of you who don't know, we had 61 people here on Sunday night, 26 hikers showed up.
That's awesome.
And honestly, it felt like we were proclaiming God's kingdom because they left knowing that Christians cared for them. And so the question becomes, how do we, and I think hospitality is a huge piece of new monasticism. It drives what it's doing. And so, and that's one of the similarities that I see in our context and new monasticism is we, in particular, for those of us who live here, year round, we have the opportunity to think of our Christian vocation around the practice of hospitality. How do we welcome even our own community members as they return? How do we welcome one another? How do we welcome the foreigner? How do we welcome the hiker? How do we welcome allow OHV drive? Not that there's a quiet OHV, so it's not good. Or the truck driving down the road at 5:30. Okay. Speed bumps.
Yeah, we want some.
Yeah.
I'm working on it. I'm working on it.
You know my clown method.
Yeah.
In the wee hours of the night, dress like a clown and jump out of cars.
It's either that or people.
All right, other questions. Definitions. So, and we'll get to these when we get to some of them, but I'll give you a brief. Missional, uses the word a lot, missional. Missional theology is really something that has came about probably in the last, fully in the last sort of 50, 60 years. It was a critique, it started really as a critique of the missionary movement and the idea that we were going to other countries and taking Western values to a country and saying, this is our version of Christianity, you have to express it the same way, as opposed to saying, this is the biblical version of Christianity, how might it actually birth within the context of You know, in other words, we went and we said education for the way we thought needed to be happen in a certain context, and maybe that was okay that education didn't happen there. The gospel can still be proclaimed, love for neighbor can still be taught, without saying, I'm gonna import what I'm, but we still do this. I mean, like, and honestly, you know, every other country in the world looks to the US for age and stage curriculum. I mean, Australians complain all the time. They rely on us to produce curriculum for them, which is problematic because we're all like, spring, Easter, joyful, new life, and they're in the Southern Hemisphere. They're like, it's going to winter when Easter comes around, going into the darkest time of the year. And so it's very different context. So, you know, that contextualization matters when things start to spread. But missional theology really deals with the essential nature of the gospel. So the gospel we find in the story and in the action of Jesus Christ dying, coming to earth, dying on the cross, resurrecting, and going, returning to heaven, and the promise of the Spirit. This is the narrative that Jesus brought. And missional theology says that is the proclamation. Why? Because if we buy into this life-changing event, then we say we confess this, then we are confessing that 2,000 years ago, God, the divine, out of the material of Christianity, their being, their spirit self, to be brought into this kingdom, then it ought to change how we live our lives. If we truly believe that this is, we get 70 to 100 years on this earth and then that's it, and that the real essence of who we are exists beyond this realm, then it makes us change how we view not only ourselves in relationship to the world, but how I relate to others, because it's temporal. So missional theology is about that witness. What are we doing to bear witness to this gospel? And the challenge is that in a comfortable American Christianity, and what you'll find in this book, and you will critique, is the comfort of our Protestant American Christianity that says, we're comfortable. It's good to be comfortable. It's good to have our own things, to be ourselves. And so this is going to push some of you, and I'm not going to deny that. It doesn't mean that everything in here has to be true. This is a conversation starter.
Well, bearing witness to our Christianity is leading by example. It's living a good life. I have a brother that's an atheist, and my daughter had a hard time with that. So if she wanted to like run away from it, and I said, you can't, because otherwise he can't see, you know, the way we live. And
I 100% agree. And I think that actually the strongest testimony that this faith community that we're in has is how we live our lives together. Which is why when Lynn needs help cleaning, could Lynn have hired something to clean? Sure. Could they, you know, if they found someone, she's in the midst of it. She needed help. We as a community went there to help her. That should happen for every single person who comes into our community. That if there's a need, we say, I'm going to put aside what I have to do to meet the need of this other person, because that's what we're called to be, a community.
Right.
All right. I'll define a couple of the words going on. I want to go through this, and I want to talk about a few things. If you turn to page 9, Roman numeral 9 at the bottom, it says introduction. He just starts by talking about his first edition of it. He took the appendix of this book, and it became the 6th chapter. And again, I don't know the differences, and I'll highlight them if I see things, or if he highlights something else as it goes on. Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove, who is the author of this book and is edited by the Ruppa House, is the community that he runs in the Carolinas. I don't remember if it's north or south, I don't remember, but one of the Carolinas. I remember when he ran this conference that he mentions back in 2004, because I had just started my MDiv, And I had just started to study intentional community. So I didn't make it to the conference, but I had spoken with Jonathan on many occasions because of my monastic connection to Tze. I have watched the monastic movement, the new monasticism for a while, and his involvement in it. And I really I have nothing but respect for what they do. This book here, if you really are interested in new monasticism, is what their community wrote, 12 Marks of New Monasticism. And there's nothing weird about it. I mean, some of them are like the relocation part is the only part that most people are like, I don't want to relocate somewhere. But we already live here together, so no one wants to relocate. So that's the beauty of that. But their efforts in the way this book sort of got shaped was around the idea of hospitality. They wanted to be a community of hospitality. And so over time, you flip the page, it just basically started telling you the background of some of that. His son, whose name is Jonathan Wilson as well, or Jonathan Hartgrove, and then he took his wife's name, so now he's Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove. But if you turn the page into the introduction on 10, there was a point where, and you see sort of that second paragraph in, he identifies it that he says, now I know the book is about new monasticism from beginning to end. Admittedly, I think that I wish he didn't do that. This is why we like the old version. I think the old version actually speaks to a much broader picture. This is sort of curtailing it towards new monasticism. So let's just pretend that that's not there. There definitely has been a rise in monasticism as a whole. New monasticism in terms of communities being formed, and largely they are younger boomers and my age Gen Xers who have done it, sort of brought together. New monasticism and generally, and this page and really leading into the next, he's kind of giving you a little bit of a portrait of where new monasticism is at. And so he says a number of things. One, they generally have a distrust of institutions, and not that they abandon all institutions, but they have a distrust of, and it's not surprising. I mean, Wall Street, government, we may side with policies that fit in what he'll call a Nietzschean sort of understanding of moral ethics, but we don't really trust them. When the push comes to shove, we really don't trust the government. We really don't trust big business. We really don't trust Wall Street. We really don't trust insurance companies. When you look at the institutions that govern, and sometimes we don't trust the church, and in many cases we don't. We have old Generation X in the church because they don't trust them. So you have this entire culture where you have a breakdown of institutions and people's trust in them. We still live by them because we can't control them, but we don't trust them as much. New monasticism has a stark critique of that based on modernity and post-modernity. And I'll go back to that as I started that earlier. So modernity is the beginning of the scientific intellectual revolution that started around the mid-1700s, 1750, and goes all the way up to 1950. Most sociologists would name the beginning of post-modernity, being after modernity at the beginning of 1950, and saying that we're living in it now, and it will be a smaller era that transitions us out into whatever the next era is. And we don't know what that era is because you name them long after they started. But what is true, and what he does emphasize here on this page X, is that that new monasticism is very much locally focused, which is one of the ways I think that this community here, our church in particular, has a very strong similarity. We're all about local embeddedness. We are here, we live here, you visit, you come live here in the summer. We invest in this town because it matters, because it's where we live and it's our local environment. So in other words, we care what's happening. And you may think, well, of course, that's not normal. I lived in Louisville, and so I didn't care what was going on. There was, like most of the time, I was mad at most people because they were horrible drivers and I didn't want to be around them. You forget what it's like to live in, some of you go back and forth in Chicago, you realize that. But that sense of community is so strong here that sometimes, even only being a year and a half, I've already sort of forgotten the trauma of living in regular society. So the new monasticism, and perhaps even and I think our expression is already local, so that's that connection there. New monasticism, he believes, is a movement that is helping explain why modernity, that period between the Enlightenment and the 50s, and post-modernity from the 50s to the present, are failing us. And really, it's all kind of one project. It's just sort of post-modernity is kind of like why What we found in postmodernity is everything's relativistic. You think that that's your experience, you can do what you want. Your experience is not my experience. You can't tell me what my experience is. You can't even define what reality or truth is in this day and age. Why? Because everything's broken down. And everything looks to the source of the individual for the authority of that. And for so long, you did it. You looked to the experience of those older than you in the context you were in, because you lived in a culture that actually held you to those sense of morality. And the last time we see that really is probably the 1930s and 40s. World War II did a number on it as we emerged out of that. And I've said this before, and I'll teach about this again to you in more detail. There was a huge psychological movement that came about through the last century. You know, Freud and Piaget and Erickson, and names Freud probably recognized. And then all the way up to, Dr. Phil and, Dr. Ruth and all these doctors who come pop psychology, and they all came on and they're all giving advice and they're all giving opinions, because sometime between, the early 1900s to sort of really the whole century is characterized by this emphasis on the individual. When you start focusing on the brain and the individual and how we're unique, how we're different in our own particularities, and we're at a hypersensitivity point where you can't, you walk into a restaurant in the most suburban places and they're like, what allergies do you have? Do you eat this? Do you want dairy-free? Or you go to coffee, it takes you 5 minutes to order your coffee. The things that we have control over to suit our idiosyncrasies is unlike anything in culture that has ever been experienced. Oh no, I want 4 pumps of chocolate in my Starbucks Frappuccino. Don't put 6 in there, I'll know. Like just that sense of I'm going to, and earphones. We put our earphones in, and as someone who traveled, I wore earphones all the time. Why? Just to block out the noise. But that means I have a constant soundtrack or comedian or podcast, or I have curated the environment around me to be the thing that suits me the most. We have machines. Alexa, raise the volume. I can't go over and turn up. It's kind of like a whole new level of. But we have machines that, so we have come to a place where individualism, and this is a challenge to the church, because we've gone from a mission-oriented church that says, I belong to a church, and that I think was present in the silent generation, those going from 20 and 40, where it says, I belong to a church to serve the mission of the church. Sometime since that, and it did happen sometime during the late silent generation. And again, I don't blame boomers for, I know most of you are boomers, and if you weren't all boomers, I'd probably tell a few boomer jokes. But I don't blame boomers, because that's just the environment that you grew up in. But that shift from communal sentiments to individual catering ramped up in the middle of the last century in ways we never could have fathomed. Yeah.
But that's not all bad.
It's not all bad, but nothing is all bad, right? I mean, there's always a good side and a bad side to everything.
Yeah.
We'll get to that though.
Okay.
It is bad when it's when it's too much. It's out of balance. The minute and the scriptures make it very crystal clear. You regard others as better than they are. You regard others as, I don't know, some verses say better, you regard others before yourself.
Right.
So in a highly individualistic culture, regarding the other before yourself is not an ethic that we commonly employ. So on page 10, it is essentially the last paragraph. I have to start, and I said the way through this tension is a process of discernment, the practical moral reasoning engaged by communities that are seeking to be well-formed. And what he's basically saying is communities that are being intentional about their way they're living together ought to be part of the conversation of how we rebuild culture, because they're thinking about it. They're aware of the issues, they're aware of the challenges, and they're engaging. So he's trying to highlight the importance of new monastic communities. And you'll see about 4 lines down, they said it takes some time to mature and to live into their rule, their life together. In my dissertation, I wrote that I think that it's very, I think it's a very positive and beneficial thing for communities of faith to develop a rule to live by. Because I think that we do it in every other culture, in every other part of our culture, we have contracts for everything. This isn't like if you break it, you're gonna get fired from the church. But that sense of saying this matters, I mean, boomers would call mission statements. This movement would call the rule of life. Page I1 or 11 deals with, I think, some of the temptations, and this is part of the conversation that if you had watched new monasticism emerge over the last 20 years or so, they've been put in the spotlight and hailed, and so it's kind of like this counterintuitive, how do you be monastics and kind of keep a simple sort of try to existence and just live out faithfully your witness, and also be in the spotlight and get lots of speaking gigs and do realize of writing contracts and spreading too soon with the recognition that when Christianity first spread around Constantine, it didn't stick because it was an artificial spread that was meant to make the gospel acceptable to people rather than people acceptable to the gospel. He goes into the bottom part of that talking about communes, and then really from the middle of page 11 of the Roman numerals, he mentioned some of those communities, Jacuza, Jesus People USA, and Rebel Place. I've been in both of those communities. They're great communities, shared meals with them. It's really a crazy testimony, and they're doing incredible work. It's not for me. I don't want to live in that. So that's why I like more of a retirement community than asking expression. So I'm here. And so then he wants to address some of the issues between them. He says, one, they're not, so communes came out in the 60s and 70s, and even some of them being Christian, they got accusations of being isolations. They were just rejecting society. I'm going to go off and do my own thing. I'm going to go out in the woods. I think the funny thing about that is we've already kind of accepted a little bit of the isolationist life because we're here. So for different reasons, for non-spiritual reasons, we have chosen to be in an environment or to spend our summers or, be connected to an environment that does isolate us from the rest of the world. So again, part of the reason reading this was like, there were so many connections about what's happening here that are already sort of in the DNA of a monastic expression. So we're separatists, they're separatists, but they didn't intend to be. We didn't intend to be separatists, and neither did St. Benedict. St. Benedict was trying, the minute they got organized, they started to do communal mission. This is a community. The amount of things that they do for that region, they're the ones who rejuvenated the whole farming area. Like the farmers were desolate, and they went out and taught farmers how to, and then there's all monastic movements typically have an outward expression. We just don't associate with them because our image of monasticism is in a cave somewhere, or in a wilderness somewhere, or Iceland. So he's saying new monasticism is not like that. And I'm saying that I don't think the church is supposed to be like that. He wouldn't assert that type. At the bottom of that page, you say the second difference of new monastics, between communes and new monastics. It's not a rejection of establishment. And in other words, like the communes of the 60s and 70s were just like, we're rejecting everything. He's saying, no, we actually don't want to reject the church. We want to make ourselves an humble submission to the church. So kind of in what I would say is a quasi, it's got a little bit of hubris in there, but in a very humble way. They're saying, we're here to sort of highlight a new way of living for the church. They see themselves as being sort of a testimony to the larger church. 3 on the beginning of page XII or 11 in the introduction. I'll just say the regular number. You can translate it in case you forgot. 3, the motivation he identifies. He says in that first paragraph, he's saying that communes had this idealism of living in a utopian world sort of thing. And he says actually they're grounded in realism. Now, realism is a philosophical ideal that sort of comes out and basically says that things are real in and of themselves, outside of us. We can have a conversation about something, but there still can be an entity of the topic of the conversation almost as a lived entity of themselves. And I think he's saying that actually the things that we are experiencing in the world in the flesh are real. They're happening to us, and we participate in them, and they also have a sort of being outside of us as well as real. So it's acknowledging in many ways a very spiritual realm that exists around us, that there is a spirit of hospitality that can exist, and it's a very real thing. It's not ephemeral sort of, you can't grab onto it, it's an idea. There's actually a thing of hospitality. And honestly, after being at the hiker meal on Sunday, I felt like those hikers are so grateful to be welcomed here. And apparently Lucky said they were just a buzz that night. They came back and they kept talking about it. And then before they left in the morning, they were all talking about it. It's on, I'm seeing it on the Facebook pages too. Everyone's thanking us for doing it, and it's just beautiful. Yeah.
They were talking about it at breakfast at children, the hikers that were coming through there in the morning.
Oh, really? Okay, there you go.
They were coming in and talking about the hot dog, everything, and how welcome they felt, excuse me. They were, like I said, they were really talking about.
And realism will say that is a real thing that exists outside of us that we participate in. So real realities. So, and the way he grounds that is saying the realism is that we're all sinners and we're all fallen, and they recognize this is never going to be an ideal expression. Believe it or not, as a student who studied social theory throughout the last 2,000 years, when Karl Marx wrote the issues, when he wrote his first sort of stab at what eventually became his Communist Manifesto, you would have thought it was a Christian writing about his concern for his brother. Now, what happened was, as it became more systematized and then implemented, corrupt people took a hold of it. But at a core of what it was, it could have been gospel. It was concern about people being connected to their labor. Why should I work for this and then you take all the money and you give me a small fraction? I should be able to receive the benefits of what I do. And it's concerned because he said it would strip that person of their dignity, of their humanity. The minute you make someone else your servant or your slave or you benefit off their back and then you give them something back for it, you strip them of their dignity. And that was the essence of what he was. Now it got twisted and turned, and it ended up into something very ugly. We're seeing the effects of that in a horrendous way right now in Cuba. I mean, like horrid. But that doesn't mean at the core there wasn't some sense of saying we need to care for one another. And you'll find that at the base of that. Not an ideal community, but one that recognizes that there's some. And the last thing he says about new monasticism. The last thing he says about new monasticism, and I'm going to sort of skip over the next, or I'm going to skip over the next part, but I'll just go quickly. Is new monasticism a call to a vocation away from, not away from the culture, but away from the way that Christianity has sort of been brought up into this next, into the current expression we have. There's a recognition that we have gone astray. He goes in and basically this guy named D.A. Carson, who was a professor at Trinity Evangelical Seminary in Chicago and co-founder of the Gospel Coalition, makes a few accusations against him. He throws this book, Christ and Culture, which is a great book. There's basically a prototype of 5, a typology of 5 different ways. It's Christ against culture. These are the 5 ways. You need to write them down. I don't remember. Just Christ against culture, and that's what he's accusing them of, sort of like we're the Anabaptists or the Quakers, we're the Amish, we're going to step out of culture and be another. And so that's a rejection of culture. There's the Christ of culture, which is an accommodation of Christ, making sort of Christ adapting Christ to the culture that's there, not in a materialistic way, but in sort of saying Christ is the savior of culture. There's a Christ above culture, which sort of places Christian thought above all the rest of society. There's Christ and culture, which says they really don't gel. One's an expression of humanity, one's an expression of divinity, and there's a paradox in it. And then Christ, the transformer of culture, which is kind of like you baptize everything. And we actually are very heavily in the US in this sort of transformer of culture, because we feel like the church should be transforming everything about culture. And the truth is, and what Niebuhr does in this, and says that actually the church is all bits and pieces of these. And when any of them become the sole dominant expression of the church, we lose a sense of balance. So he refutes this idea that they are against culture, saying they're actually called to proclaim culture. If you turn to page 13, he addresses that critique. And all you need to know, he is addressing the critique that was given to him and said he wanted to be separatist. And he kind of, and I gotta be honest with you, this DA person was kind of a jerk, if it's true what he said, I didn't see all of it, but you don't, he is sort of saying, oh, you just like your, Stanley Hauerwas is a pretty prominent professor out of Duke, he's Methodist. He's this fan, I love everything he's written. He's this small little man with a voice like Mike Tyson, really high and squeaky, and he swears like you wouldn't believe, regardless of where he's at. At Princeton Seminary, we had to ask him before we brought him in to speak not to swear, and I think he still did like 8 times, but he didn't drop the F-bomb, so it was good. It was a good day. We thought it was a success. So just don't say that. So, but he's the thing about it, and honestly, because he's got this sort of twang, he starts coming out, and he gets going, and it just flows, and everyone knows he does it, so it's kind of a caricature. But anyway, that's who. So they're accusing him of basically filtering Stanley Hauerwas out in his book. So that's just not. It's kind of an attack of the person. It's not really an attack of an argument, and so it's kind of a low blow. From that halfway point down. It deals really with the idea that he makes a defense, and he says, I am open to the idea that monastic communities can live a separatist expression, but that is not consistent with the argument he's making in his book, which is the gospel needs to be proclaimed through communities. And new monasticism is meant really to point you to that proclamation. So all of this is front-loading stuff. It's not even what the book is about. He's setting the stage up, he's dealing, saying, I'm gearing this towards new monasticism. Here are some critiques from my last book. This is all sort of just introductory, like he's got to get this stuff out of the way, because if he doesn't, there's someone who's going to raise a critique of him, and he's trying to address these critiques before they actually hit him. If you can look at on 14, this is 14. XIV, yeah, really funny. 14, XIV. Halfway down, I want to read that first phrase. This book is written under the conviction that the church in Western culture, where we live, is in grave danger of compromising its faithfulness to the gospel. This is at the core of his book. He feels like what we have been called to proclaim in the gospel, we've compromised. That's just, that's the heart of it. If you look down a few sentences down, this book is also written under the conviction. And those are the signifiers. And if you never read the book by Mortimer Adler, How to Read a Book, it's worth the time reading it. It'll tell you how to, because there's all sorts of cues and things that are present in books that allow you to read through them much faster. When I had 1,500 to 2,000 pages of reading to do in a week during a PhD seminar, I did not actually read all of that. You read around it, and that's what. But some of the, so when you read an introduction, you look for this book is written under the conviction. That tells you something important is coming. This book is also written under the conviction, so that's your second point. That changes are taking place in Western culture, present a wonderful opportunity for faithful witness to the gospel. As the church in the West re-examines its own life and witness, and discovers once again the power of the gospel of Jesus to redeem humanity. Now, here's the thing. What he's saying is that there's a danger where we've compromised it, but given where we're at right now, this sort of crux of this shifting, changing in times, and that's not just right now because of COVID, that's the last 50 to 70 years we're experiencing the shift and change in post-modernity. We have an incredible opportunity to revisit what it means to be the church, because some of those basic things have been stripped away. And we're asking intentional questions. What are we doing here? Why are we doing these things? What is a faithful expression? And in the context we're in, a faithful expression for CPC in Lake City is not the same as a faithful expression for Central Presbyterian in Denver. Different context, different environment, different people. We have to figure that out. But right now, if you look at the expression of the church and what we do on Sundays, it's sort of the life of the church, quite frankly, it matches about 90% of the churches in the Presbyterian denomination. That are small, that are meeting together on a weekly basis, and I participate in that, and continuing in that tradition as well. But that doesn't mean it has to. In other words, like this is a call to say, let's be intentional about what we do. The bottom last thing, when he talks about Bolivia and China, he's just talking about how it's been received broadly. That doesn't really make a huge difference. And then he does say on page 15, the Great Commission is at the center of all of this, that call to proclaim. And he makes an explicit thing, and beneath that quote of Matthew 28 there on page 15, he basically says, we've been called to make disciples, to baptize them, and to teach them. That's it. That is the essence of what we are called to do. We color that a lot of different ways, but Christ just said, make disciples, baptize, teach. And so that's what he wants to focus on, and that's the expression of the gospel. It says, and he says, so the gospel, which is the church's commission to proclaim, is not something we merely conjure up from the past or hope for in the future, meaning it's not something we just proclaim because it happened in the past, and we're like, well, this is a monumental event, we should say it, or because we think heaven and judgment days that have come. And this is an important thing because this is why we're doing this now. Though it certainly has a past and a future, rather the redemption of Jesus Christ is a present reality that he is actively accomplishing in our world today, in and through us. But that's the important thing. Is sometimes we think it's the past, we think it's the future. No, it is that. This is what we are called to. The gospel is meant to be lived out in the present time. It's not something we pull from the past and go to the future. It's our present. And at the bottom, at the last paragraph, he says, we have a responsibility to proclaim this and to bear witness. We have a responsibility to look at the state of culture that we're in. You know what? The gospel has not been expressed and proclaimed the same way in 2,000 years. As a student of church history, I can tell you, maybe in the last 50 years, we have some similarities, but the changes and shifts of what was considered a faithful expression over the last 2,000 years has shifted all over the place. Why? Because culture has shifted. Now we've seen a lot more of that shifting in the last 50 to 70 years. Why? Because culture has shifted more in the last 50. So the church, and the challenge we have these days is, you buy a phone. I just got a new phone so I could actually make phone calls, but it's a year old. But in 3 years, I'm gonna need a new one because technology is changing. Shows change, food changes, things come and go. Everything is constantly changing. And right now we're in this crux between really in our political scene and the fact that these groups are buying all sorts of stocks and that's what the stock price is. We're in this time of massive revolution in our culture and change. And what's absolutely perfect about that is we can choose intentionally and thoughtfully who we want to be and what a faithful expression is, in particular in this environment. So that's kind of what he's saying. He mentions African and polygamy, and kind of like you can't take the gospel here and go there and just say all of a sudden polygamy is wrong, and then because all of a sudden there's going to be a bunch of wives that are just sort of thrown out on there. You got to choose, and also this guy has got to choose between all. Like you're creating a dilemma. So just going in there and saying polygamy is wrong that's not proclaiming the gospel. And in fact, going in there and loving them, honestly, King David was but not judging a culture. And honestly, this is, for those of you who are Methodists, the PCUSA has a little bit more of an open policy on sexuality. Many of you know that, and a lot of you don't like that, and there's nuances to that. But Methodist Church is going through that. But I never supported, PCUSA, we're a USA church. We work through it. We're representatives around the country. We decided as a denomination to figure this out, and church representation from across the country made decisions. You can't do that with Methodists because it's not a US denomination, it's a world denomination. And you can't say to someone in Africa that you have to accept someone because of their sexuality, because it's different than the norm, because that is so not their culture, and to impose that upon them is another form of imperialism. So the Methodist Church has struggled with it and has to figure out, and they're going to have to fragment into a U.S. fraction in order to get where they're hoping to go. But as long as they're a world church, that cannot and should not ever happen because it's enforcing our Western ideals on Westerners. So that's essentially what he's saying there. He's saying, so my question is again, in the last line of that paragraph, and that on page 16, that witness must always discern the present reality of that redemption, the shape of the church's position. In other words, we as a community of faith need to look around, and then the hyper ministry is just one small little teeny slice of that pie. It could be a big piece, but to say, hey, that's a need, that's a way that we can proclaim God's mission. That's a perfect way as a community to do that. But finding those spaces and ways that we're actually making the proclamation more than just me in a pulpit on Sunday. I'll keep doing that. But we're called to this as a community, not me as just as a pastor. It goes into, and this, the next part, the bottom of this, I would say that from here on out, from about halfway about down, is where you really want to start. All the previous stuff that's in this chapter, just read over it. It'll probably make a little more sense now that I've kind of framed it. But if you really want to start paying attention, where it starts to get actually sort of the core of what he's trying to get at is from sort of here and out. He says that in the third paragraph down, this understanding of mission and God's purpose of proclaiming the mission. In other words, above that, he says, no matter what happens, the infallibility of God's word is going to be proclaimed. That's okay. You can catch it online, Dave.
Absolutely.
We have a hospital.
Good, that's good. I'm doing something good. Nice save. But he's saying no matter what, God's plan's gonna come out. It's gonna, we're gonna close. God's plan is gonna be proclaimed. And he says that down at the bottom, he says the problem is this understanding of the mission of the church must be disciplined by the gospel and firmly grounded in the conviction that relevance is an intrinsic characteristic of the gospel and not a demand of the culture. And this is one of the biggest things that I think the last 50 years has hurt the church with, because we're always trying to be relevant to the culture. Accept us, like us. We'll have bigger programs and better youth groups and bigger churches and more fantastic gatherings, and accept us so you can be like us. And what he's saying is we don't have to be relevant to the culture because the gospel has an inherent and intrinsic relevance that is always universally accepted. We're free from the boundaries of sin and death in this world, and free to the spirit beings and to love one another in ways that we couldn't prior to Christ. So he's really, the whole thing, you'll see this issue of acceptance and relevance, and we shouldn't seek that. And we've been so shaped by marketing ideals to say we have to market. Frankly, that's what I did in youth ministry. When I went to London, youth ministry. In less than a year, I created a youth ministry of 140 kids. How? Because I got some bouncy castles and got a gym and had a big exciting time and got the kids there, and they started coming back. And sure, I started preaching to them, but the minute I left that environment a couple of years later, they youth group fell to pieces and they weren't there anymore. Were they coming because they were being transformed by God and by Christ? Or were they coming because it was a fun environment where they got to bounce around in a big piece of plastic? This is the misnomer of putting pool tables and ping pong tables and old sofas in the basement of a youth group, somehow thinking that our youth will want to be attracted to these dank basements with stinky, furniture, and somehow that is an expression of the gospel. What makes us think that that's what youth want? The gospel meets a much deeper need that youth have. How about questions about life? Who are they? What are they supposed to do with their life? What is the meaning of life? Do they have value? Those are the questions that teenagers deal with, not where am I going to play ping pong. But we as a church dress up our basements and try to get them in because we think that if we're acceptable to them, that we are doing the job. And he's saying, no, that's not that place. He goes on page 17 to say we have a misplaced nostalgia of what once was. And I think that the current boomer generation, probably when they say the good old days, what they mean is the 90s, where the churches were filled with people. And for whatever reason, at that time in culture, every church had the good old days of the 90s. Churches were filled, coffers were filled, churches could do everything. They were filled with mega extensions and gymnasiums. And it was an explosion between the 80s and 90s. And it seemed to be off this basis of a seeker-centered model or this sort of programmatic model. But what we discovered, is that it actually didn't work. Young people don't buy into that and don't want to be a part of that. It says about halfway down, or about maybe about 8 lines or 7 lines down on 17, the church is particularly vulnerable in times when familiar and comfortable culture is changing. So our familiar and comfortable culture right now are in a massive change because of COVID, because of political strife, because of tribalism again, because of individualism. And we're in this point of change that we need to. And it says when a culture has been regnant, admittedly I do, what does that word even mean? It means the dominant, when the culture is dominant for some time, you'll have those minor changes, but it becomes so familiar, we get so used to doing things the way we've always done it, that we forget that sometimes those things are an expression of what was rather than what is. You go down a little, at the middle, it says at this present time, I believe the church is in grave danger. He says that's the same thesis he said a little bit earlier. He's pitting basically Western culture, and he doesn't say it outright, but really what we're looking at in the larger landscape is the Western culture versus the Southern Hemisphere. We're seeing movement in terms of Christianity in the Southern Hemisphere in a world that has not been influenced by the Enlightenment and intellectualism, find tremendous results in proclaiming the gospel and conversion, if you will. The last paragraph, he says basically new monasticism is just one way that the church is seeking after renewal. And he is identifying that there are circumstances in our culture that bring new threats to the church. And honestly, I kind of said it on Sunday, and intentionally I didn't mean to go detail into that train, but I had no reason to say it, like that really sort of struck a chord. I think politics in our culture is a threat to the church.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
I totally agree.
And so this winter, I plan on writing a song, John, I plan on actually exploring though. I want to write an article for maybe like Christianity Today or something like that. They kind of making the suggestion that we as Christians should not be associated with particular, hear me out, political organizations. Not that you still can't believe in what they're advocating or vote a Republican or Democratic ticket, you can still vote. But when we give political parties the power of our voice, do we place that political party before our connection and relationships with other Christians? Food for thought.
What if? It's a whole nother
Food
subject.
for thought. We'll get to that when I write the article.
You're not gonna talk about NEA.
Was it?
You're not gonna talk about NEA,
What's NEA?
National Association of Teachers.
No, not even knows. Or the NRA.
Those are good guys.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what'll keep us safe. Okay, we're almost there. We have 3 more pages. The page 18, you kind of get the beginning. You see that at the very top, it says, since changing circumstances, and that sort of is the introduction. And now he basically is saying this is what he's going to do. He kind of centers, he said, the most powerful and far-reaching analysis of Western culture is this, and I would agree. It has impacted me tremendously. It touches on something called virtue ethics, and I'll give you like a 2-minute version of what ethics are. How we choose to live our life. Morals are the things that sort of guide and drive us and help us understand. Virtue ethics base our moral expression out of our character, not out of our action. And so, but virtue ethics believes that character is instilled in us throughout a lifetime, which is why Wilson will advocate for strong communities of practice, because you raise your children in the practices of this community and it develops their character and their ethics and their sense of virtue. And this kind of goes back to a lot of Greek philosophy of developing the virtues of people. And virtue is the disposition that you have, not that you're doing something because it's good, because you have a sense of duty, but because it's been instilled in you as a sense of right and wrong, and loving the neighbor and showing love and caring, and those things as a part of your sort of ethics. And then that is what describes your decision making. And it's usually compared or juxtaposed with 2 other types of schools of thought. One is consequential ethics, which says the end result determines the current present action. Corrie ten Boom would be someone like this when the German soldiers are in and saying, are you hiding people? In that moment, she had to make a decision. Do I lie and violate what I believe is a moral, true maxim? I shouldn't lie to protect the end result of this person being saved. Or do I stand what the other school of thought we'll talk about in a second is, which in the moment, the maxim is the most important. The moral law followed in the moment is what you need to focus on. So one says the end result justifies whatever is happening in the current context. And then you think about deontological ethics, and that just basically means sort of situational. To some extent, in the sense of the situation provides you with a question and you rely on a set understanding of right and wrong to make the decision. So Corrie ten Boom, when the German soldiers came to her, she would have said, yes, I do better sometimes, I can't lie. And the result of that is not a problem. mean, it would have been a problem, but it would have not been her responsibility. She would have been acting out of her Christian belief that to tell the truth all the time. So this doesn't deal with either of those. This says when you raise a child or you raise a person, you raise a human being in a way that they are raised around the idea of morality as a part of who you are, as it comes from your inside, it's sort of a moral consciousness, then it's not about situational ethics, nor is it about an end result. It's about following a sense of right and wrong that is instilled by a community that surrounds you. And this communal aspect of this virtue conversation will play large into it. And for the most part, you all are pretty moral, virtual, ethical, civil people. So some of this may not ring true, but you have to look at the larger culture. So believe it or not, you're probably in the top like 1% of people in the world in our country who are sort of living by ethical moral codes. The vast majority, ethics are highly subjective. And if you've ever read any studies on lies, which I did, someone turned me on to them, they're very interesting, or seen video. Most of the country lies. Most of the country lies.
Especially the government.
Especially the government,
Amen.
which are a representation of the people. So true to form.
Not really.
So this is what he's talking about. He's talking about this thing called virtue ethics. I know we're about we're over time. I'm going to boost through this here. He talks about Nietzsche. Don't worry about Nietzsche. What Nietzsche's basically saying is that you are basing your own morality off of how you feel in the moment, your emotions, or how much power and influence you can exert over someone else. And it's a sort of this depraved way of operating in the world. But what he's saying is that what he sees right now in the Western landscape is more of a Nietzschean ethic that says, I will make decisions morally based on how it makes me feel, and the disadvantage or advantage I will have over you in the relationship. So I'll make a decision if it advantages, because ultimately my own well-being is what I'm sort of after. So that's kind of that page. You'll see words like Aristotelian Christianity. Aristotle, the larger school of thought is Plato, said that we can kind of sort of that right or goodness comes from pondering and thinking. Aristotle said goodness or virtue comes from practice. So it's the opposite. So one says if you know good, you'll do good. One says if you do good, then you learn to know good. And so this is very much in that when we train ourselves and we are raise children to do good in the collective environments, then they will embody goodness because it's the only thing they will know. Last page, I think the very last page, I don't know. So this is the last page I have anything to say. He goes down, and this is the breakdown of our next 6 weeks together. The first chapter will be the history, and I've done a little bit of that, so you have a little bit of background if you want to read that. His argument is you need to know church history. You really don't have any business saying where church should go if you don't have any idea where we come. And if you think that somehow we have the right expression, if you look back at 2,000 years of church history, you'll realize quickly we don't. We will, once we're done with this walk through the whole Bible, and we maybe skip back and we'll do the Apocrypha, but my suggestion at that point is we'll move on to the early church and we'll actually go through the history of the last 2,000 years. We'll do like a century at a time or so, period of time. But I think it's important to know where we've come from. So he says that, and that's good. Two, and unfortunately, Glenda left, the fragmentation over pluralism. The short of that is we're in a time of fragmentation. Pluralism is the idea that different ideals can coexist. So if you're a pluralist, you'd say, you know what? Maybe the Muslims have it right. Maybe the Buddhists have it right. Maybe Jews are right too. And we're all right. And we're all passed to God. And I acknowledge all. That's the allowance, or not even the tolerance, but the acceptance that multiple views could have truth in them. That is not what's going to happen. We are fragmented in its truth, my truth against your truth. And that's where that fragmentation comes from. And the tribalism we saw over the last sort of 4 to 6 years, really probably the last decade, I would say, tribalism that has slowly grown and I think heightened over the last few years. That is that your truth against truth, your people against my people. And that's my big issue just with politics, is that it turns Christians against Christians. So 2, 3, the morality, it says morality. Yours, the rest of you, explain where, just how we view truth and reality and ethics and all those sort of things, and how that has led to a misunderstanding of our mission to proclaim the gospel. So 3 will be a big chapter where things come together, where you're going to know this is why he's saying what's happened over the last few years has failed us. 4, he'll give perspective, the subjective authority or relativism, he's going to dig into that. 5 deals with the solution, and he'll turn to Aristotle and to Augustine and to Aquinas to basically say there's a new way from scripture that come together as communities. And after 6, he'll paint a what we need to do is look at that not as us being an expression of monasticism, but in his explanation of an expression of monasticism, what fits well with our community. And that's the introduction. Woo! It's good.
Yeah.
So the short of it, that's all. That's the heavy lifting. From here on out, you're going to learn about the history. You're going to learn about how we're fragmented. You're going to learn about the morality in Western culture, his alternative to that morality, and how we can express the gospel. He is creating an argument. So this is the background. You don't even have to remember any of this. Read through it, glance through it, and just move on. And at the end, I promise you will see a picture of this at the end. When we get to that last chapter, portraying monasticism, you'll say, hey, there are places, I guarantee you, there are places where our church resonates with this. And which part, and I'm not, and this is your church. I'm a servant to this church. I'm part of the church, but I'm a servant in this church. I'm here to expose you to ideas and the thoughts and the things that help you as a church wrestle with your expression of witnessing the gospel. So, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. Was that so? Now, if you have casual questions.